Support for Amplified Voices comes from the Restorative Action Foundation. Learn more at restorativeactionalliance.org.
Everyone has a voice, a story to tell. Some are marginalized and muted. What if there were a way to amplify those stories? To have conversations with real people in real communities? A way to help them step into the power of their lived experience. Welcome to Amplified Voices, a podcast lifting the experiences of people and families impacted by the criminal legal system. Together, we can create positive change for everyone.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Amplified Voices. I'm Amber, your co-host, here to reintroduce our conversation with guest Brittany LaMarr. This is part 2 of a 2-part story. If you have not listened to part 1, please go to season 4, episode 7 of the podcast. When we left off with Brittany, she had just found out that she was going to have a child and would soon be sentenced. Join us as we delve further into her experience with the criminal legal system and all of the things that she has done since to help change the narrative.
I struggled during that time. I got into a relationship, what they tell you not to do, with somebody in rehab. And so, I was on the bracelet. And so when I got out of that 6-month program, and I was living in an apartment with that person for 6 months up until my sentencing with the bracelet on. And I found out I was pregnant during that time. And then by the time I was sentenced for the crimes that had occurred a year and a half before then, I was 7 months pregnant. And so at my sentencing, when I got sentenced to 4.5 years, I was 7 months pregnant.
So you were between 7 and 8 months when you were incarcerated.
Right.
How long was the sentence?
4.5 years.
4.5 years. So on the day you're walking in that this baby is coming out, while you're behind bars.
Right.
And so
was there any attempt at mitigation because of that?
Yeah, they could have delayed it for a few months, right?
Correct. My lawyer tried that. We went in, and my mom and I very much had an expectation, and my child's father at the time, that this would maybe be a year and a half at most. And then when the judge was able to give up to a maximum of 5 years in the plea deal, and my attorney had, I thought that this was maybe a year and a half. And then in my head, after learning about some things, I'm like, okay, maybe if I do half of that, that's 9 months. So I was still trying to come to terms with okay, how old will my child be? Okay, only 6 months, only 8 months, right? And then I just sort of blacked out when I heard 4.5 years. I just stopped hearing anything else the judge said. I mean, I came home not even knowing how much probation I had or restitution, because I heard that, and I heard nothing else.
So I just want to take a minute to acknowledge, what you just said and say that I am really sorry that happened to you, because of course, as a mother myself, I can't even begin to imagine, what that meant for you. And so I know that we're getting to a part of your story that can be a little bit painful. So I want you to take the space that you need and only talk about whatever it is that you'd like to talk about. But I do want to highlight for the people who are listening to this conversation, sort of the harshness of a system that could have done things differently, regardless of what somebody has or hasn't done. When we think about humanity and what real accountability looks like, for me, it doesn't look like any of this.
No.
Again, I just want to say that I'm really sorry that, because I can only imagine thinking it would be one thing being there after everything that you had already been through.
Amber, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
What kind of society takes a woman who's 7.5 months pregnant when an average, typically you deliver it 9 months, you have a month and a half to go, who's been out in the community, even if it's in an ankle, we can talk about the GPS monitoring, all that, another time. But what type of a society takes a woman who's about to give birth and puts her behind bars?
One that is monstrous. I don't know, that's the only question. I mean, that's the only answer that I have. So Brittany, did you have any indication of like how that would go? Did you know anything about like what healthcare looks like in the system?
Oh, no, I had no idea about what I was, what was happening to me from there on out. And so, I don't know at what point to go here. I could talk about from my entry into the
Sure.
facility, if that makes sense. And so, and I would also note that for all of my courts, there was nobody else at the court with me. My mother, as much as she's always been someone always there, I would not be where I am today without my mother. And I can imagine for her and who she is, like this wasn't something that she could be there for or support or any of those things. So she was very hands off, but a support system. So I also had nobody there the day of sentencing. My friend who I've been speaking about, my mom had dropped me off at the courthouse. My friend had met me there. And so we sort of hung out. He was using at that time. I went into court by myself. So this was also a very big shock to my mom, but I hadn't talked to her. I don't know when she found out. This was very much different than what we had planned and expected, and the room that was set up for the baby and those sorts of things. So my goal then was to just talk to my mom. And so that was hard. I got the one phone call when I got there. But, I called my mom, but then it's like, okay, what can you call, my child's father at the time? Or have you talked to like my lawyer? Like, who do you talk to for those 3 minutes? And so I talked to her. I went again through that whole process. I you get put into the medical unit. But
what month was it?
October 31st, Halloween.
So it's at least it's not as hot as the hottest days of the year.
Right.
Going in. Okay. So
I gasped for a minute because October 31st was also the same day of my husband's arraignment. So it's a different kind of Halloween in our lives.
Yeah, for sure.
So you're in, and were you able to make any friends? Were there people who had been through what you're going through that could talk with you? Was there any type of support available for you, or were you once you're inside, was it very much continues to be an isolating experience?
It definitely continues to be an isolating experience, but I think that's also just part of who I am. And I'm not one to go out and try and befriend people or talk to people. I don't know where I am. And I've always sort of been one who internalizes. So this was just sort of more of what has always been for me, is just sort of this internal journey. And I sort of wasn't interested in what anyone else had to say, because this was my life I had to figure out. And you'll hear people had stories this way and that way, and you don't know I just knew my journey and didn't want to hear about the horror stories of other people who were pregnant experience. Like that wasn't something that was helpful to me. So
Right.
I often limited my exposure to other people because I just, as much as like, maybe it was their way of expressing like empathy or understanding, and I wasn't the only one. There was eventually, I am put in like the, regular housing units, like the same mattress, same food, all that sort of stuff. So there's nothing sort of specialized there. I don't know at what point, right? Because I don't have direct access to a doctor. So you just wait and hope that a doctor reaches out to you for like an appointment or something. Which, ends up happening, I believe a month in. And so, but there was at the time, it was like a group for before pregnancy. So there was about 8 of us in there in a group with one social worker. But we got a pamphlet on like what giving birth is like. Cause again, these aren't conversations I've ever had with anyone. So I don't know like what to expect. So we get a pamphlet and it's like about birth. And so I try and like read this in my unit and figure out like physically what's going to happen to me, like what to expect, like the process, those sorts of things. But the group consisted of a lot of women who were still just trying to figure out where their kids were going to go. And that's hard. I know my situation was, I was very lucky to be able to plan out to have, my mom be there. Like you have to, it's very tricky in which like my mom, while I'm in the hospital for the 3 days that you get, needs to be at court and given like the guardianship and those sorts of things within the 3 days, right? Or there's, like DCF involvement and the child goes somewhere and then to my mom. So it was very like a timely situation in which like we needed to time it, but I had somebody. I would say at least half of those women, that was not the case in that group. So the time of that group very much consisted on support for them, this one social worker trying to figure it out.
Yeah. So I mean,
then,
what you're describing though is that in your particular case, that was one stressor that was taken off. I mean, you knew you were going to be parted from your baby,
right?
But your baby was going to go to your mother,
right.
and be taken care of in your family. This is
right.
something that
right.
you had. But what you're describing is that there are women that don't have that privilege,
right?
And that they're not only are they in the situation that you were in, where they're about to give birth, but they also have no idea what's going to happen, whether they're going to be separated forever from their
right.
child, and that they'll never get to see the baby ever again. Because I was actually, isn't that a thing where if if you're incarcerated for a certain length of time,
right.
and the baby's not with you, you
yeah.
lose parental rights. So that's
there's
really scary.
And getting into that, once you're sort of put into like the postpartum group, I mean the stories just get worse after someone gives birth. It's 6 months and the mom still has no idea where the kids are and nobody's gotten in contact with somebody. I mean the compounded trauma of that experience is entirely opposite of how someone should be put in a place to succeed when they leave. 6 months from their release, after going through all of this,
Yeah.
I don't think it's reasonable to expect someone to come out and be better off, for sure.
Right, for sure.
So what you're describing was, I'm sorry, go ahead, Amber.
That's all right. So Brittany, you described sort of being in those groups, and any person who has gone through the process of childbirth knows that it's a process where, particularly the first time it happens to you, you don't know what to expect just out in the world, right? Like if you haven't talked about it or you haven't had support services. So the idea that somebody would be handed a pamphlet while, having already lost their freedom and be surrounded by people that, for support with one social worker, that just seems really overwhelming. And then on the flip side, one of the things that I found as a woman after giving birth to my first child was, I wish I would have known what happens after. What happens to my body after, what happens to my emotions after. And that in a regular situation is challenging, much less in a situation like you found yourself in. So my point is, how were you feeling like with all of those things sort of coalescing and converging?
Amber, I still, there's that driving force in me that's like, and I hear my mother's voice. It's like, just keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I was sitting and feeling these things or thinking about these things. It's like, all right, this is what you have to do. It's just,
you had to. What choice did you have?
Yeah. And so that has its, it's a double-edged sword, but that's sort of how I got through that, but my time in there, I was, it was very it's visible and obvious the way that corrections officers had treated other incarcerated people, where any sort of issues that were brought up, or I'm not feeling well, or I think I'm having contraction, those sort of things, where they're not taken seriously. And because you're a woman, you're dramatic, or you're exaggerating, like you're just trying to get out of your unit. And I mean, you see those sort of scoffed at issues led to the lawsuit, which changed the laws here in Connecticut in 2018, in which the officers didn't take seriously someone's concerns that they were having contractions, which led to the individual giving birth in their cell. And so I was very, it was visible to me, like, and I also don't trust the system, didn't trust any of the people there because of how dehumanizing at which the environment is. Like, these people are not your allies. So I very much did not speak to any officer if I did not have to. And so that was also something where I'm like, okay, how do I know if I'm having contractions? And at what point, like, I very much did not want to have to say anything if I wasn't sure. And which led me to being, very dilated by the time that I said anything, because in the middle of the night, because I wanted to be sure. I was like counting it for hours before I said anything. And I think what also helped was I was like a week overdue. So when the officer asked when I was due, I guess to sort of make their own decision as to whether I was in contraction.
Because clearly they were a clinical individual that needed to make that decision.
I think maybe that's what also pushed the needle on getting me over to the medical unit. But there were times, where if there were fights or there was issues, or there was, it's a prison facility, not everyone gets along. And so those sort of loud things where I'm like, if I was home, right, I wouldn't be putting myself in situations where there's chaos, where there's stress-inducing anxiety. And so I was also aware of like the effects that would have on my child, and being a mother where like that's not the ideal situation to be in. And so those sort of things would also, compound the stress of like, how do I ensure? Because at that point I'm like, okay, how do I just make sure that my child does not grow up with any sort of like internal like issues because of me? Like, how can I ensure that from like birth he's on a path to success? And I know it starts in the womb, and I know it starts with like prenatal health and those sort of things. And I'm like, am I already fucking up here? And I can't control it. I can't do better. I can't remove myself from a situation.
So you had a layer of guilt that to yourself, a lot of pressure on yourself because of a situation that you couldn't control at that point.
Right.
And then you started describing before you're having these contractions. You in a normal circumstance, you would have said, hey, I think I'm pregnant. Let's go to the hospital or and get it checked out. You're saying, well, I just have to really be sure. So you probably endured a little extra pain along the way just because of the circumstances. And then finally it gets to the point where you can't ignore it anymore. And the officer says, it's time. So a couple questions, like, can we talk a little bit about the experience, and also given your past with substance abuse, what about in terms of things that they could potentially give you to ease some of your discomfort and pain? What's going on? Where are you physically when you give birth? Do they take you to a hospital? Is it in the prison? Like, give us a picture of that experience.
Yeah, so I go over to the medical unit. They, affirm, right, you are in labor. So at that point, I'm shackled. I am put in a van and taken over to the hospital.
And the van that and just to pause you there. So we had Tracy Bernardi on the talking about going to the medical facility in the bus. You called it a van, but being, you're saying shackled, but being shackled in an unsafe cage as you're being driven over. I mean, that was because that's the same time frame, had to have been the same experience. Okay, but you're pregnant.
Yeah, and so it really sucked, every bump we hit, and not being able to cushion myself because my hands are shackled. And so I'm just sort of sitting there, taking everything. It was a very uncomfortable ride. And then
it's not quick.
No, and then you have the shame of being pushed into a hospital with shackles on, with, you're out in public, and now you're just this pregnant person. What does society think of, how horrible does somebody have to be to, what a horrible person to be a mother with, in shackles. You must be a monster. And so those are, that sort of shame and ostracization that you feel in a situation like that. And so I only have this one corrections officer next to me who I hadn't seen before. But
man or woman?
A woman. Okay. And so at that point they give the whatever fluids. I'm not quite sure. I know I needed to do what you do at a hospital where you walk, or maybe I was walking around. Maybe that happened after. I'm not sure. But I know for a couple hours I was trying to do it without the epidural, because at that point I wanted nothing to do with anything that would ever lead me to a relapse or trigger that part of me. I was very aware of how my addictive behavior and that tendency, and how it was with everything. It was like that with soccer, where it was never good enough, and I did it 1,000%, and it's just who I am. And I have to accept that. And so, but nonetheless, 2 hours in, I agreed to that epidural. And I guess within minutes, my heart rate dropped, the baby's heart rate dropped. And then all of a sudden, I'm being told I need to have an emergency C-section. I had never read anything in that pamphlet about a C-section, so I have no idea what that means. I'm extremely squeamish in general. So I start getting very ill, and I just remember my body shaking on the bed, and they're here, you have to sign this paper so we can do the surgery. And all I wanted to do was talk to my mom, who's a doctor, and be what does this mean? What's gonna happen to me? What's a C-section? What am I signing? And so I signed it, 'cause I have nobody to sort of consult on this. And I remember as I'm about to be taken to the operating room, the corrections officer says I have to go with her, and the doctor's well, no, this is a operating room, you can't be in there. And so there was a little back and forth, and then I was able to go to the operating room without the corrections officer, or maybe I don't know where she was, but I know at that point I was very scared, and so I just start it's gonna get a little graphic. I just was shaking and vomiting during the surgery, at which they had to put me out. I guess no. Okay. No, during the surgery, during the C-section, I was not shackled, because I think it was just it all had to happen. But when I woke up, I was. So I I remember because I was just getting like so ill and I was in my own head. I mean, this was just a level of anxiety that I just like was physically ill from. I remember hearing my son cry, and then I was put out. And then when I woke up in the room, and I guess that's just sort of the turning point of where I am today. And I wake up and I see a corrections officer in the corner of a room, and I hear a baby like in the next to me, and I see a shackle on my foot, and I just like look, and I just remember like looking up and being like what the fuck am I supposed to do? Like, where am I? Like, what do I do now? Like, what am I supposed to do with this kid? Like, I don't, there's nothing I can do here. And I remember like very vividly, like that's the bottom that I hit, where it's like, you either give up and like die because life can't get worse, or you do like whatever it takes to never come here again, to never be in a position like this again. And that's when I started doing like my journey of like deep inquiry. Okay, so like what does this stem from? Like what drove me? Like how do I fix these things that led to this? Because the surface level, I tried that surface level stuff of just like not using. And so that's when like my 3 years long of connection to Buddhism, connection to higher power, connection to, like I said, that sort of deep exploration of self, where I was just so vested into myself, getting to understand myself, like after acceptance of what my situation was, and a lot of the depression that I guess should be assumed that comes with that situation. At a point, upon return back to the facility, it's just like, okay, so like let's start doing the work. I started doing the steps with my sponsor. I started reading on Buddhism, meditating every morning, getting working there, attending all the groups. And it was really a very independent journey in which a discovery of self, and which I had never done before, which is why I said when you asked what I was interested in, I had no interest. I didn't know,
Right.
I didn't know myself. And this was, the time at which I like knew it was like, get to know yourself or get comfortable with like coming back, like in and out of prison.
It seems like the year before you were incarcerated, you already were starting the work that you're
Right.
describing.
Yeah.
And then this was a reaffirming, like the moment that you became, your child was born, you just had this almost like aha epiphany, like this is my life now. And things got real for you. Like now I've got to really
reality
get this.
punched me in the face.
Yeah.
And it was like,
But it was affirming. It just said, this is what we're going to do now.
yeah, I mean, you have because really I saw no other option. It's like, or just like don't live, because like it can't get worse from here. I mean, it was just.
So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that led to and what you're doing now. But before we get there, I want to just stay for a moment. I mean, first of all, I want to find out, like, did you hold the baby and that sort of thing? But before we get there, just a comment to reemphasize where we just were. I mean, I was drawn into the story. I mean, I felt like I was in the room with you, and I saw Amber's face. I know that she was in the room with you. So I hope that when people are listening, that they get that experience, like that they're with you, that they were there. It's just a very emotional story. We've told a number, we've had a number of guests on over the years now, and this is, it's one of the most emotional stories that we've heard. There's nothing like giving birth, and the story that you told about being in that room and what you went through and how scared you must have been with the C-section. I mean, it's just such a powerful moment and experience that you've had. And And there's some things that you could do that are so good with that, right? Just telling your story. So thank you for being here. We'll thank you.
Absolutely.
We'll thank you again at the end. I know it's very difficult and emotional to go through it, and you were living it again. So I want to acknowledge that. So you're reshackled. You wake up from the C-section. The baby's in the room. How quickly do they hand you you said son? They hand you your son?
Yeah.
So,
I would say like within the hour. So I have no words with the officer. I told you I have no interest in being acquainted, or I have no interest in befriending any of these people. And so the nurse comes in and was changing the baby's diaper, and asked if I wanted to hold him, or handed him to me. I think she just handed him to me. And I just didn't know what to do with that. I know I'm going back to prison in 3 days.
Sure.
So I tried. And it was a lot of work to allow myself to be vulnerable to like that natural connection to my son. One, because like my walls were up to something I already knew I was getting disconnected from.
Sure.
But two, also not having experienced an emotional connection like that growing up. It's like, how do I now do it differently, like with my son? How do I need to show affection. I was never an affectionate person. How do I go out of my comfort zone and be a different person and have a different relationship with my son? So like, these are feelings that aren't unknown to him. And so it was a very sort of complex, a lot of emotions going on there. And so, yeah, I was able to feed him and hold him. But I would say, having been from a surgery, I couldn't move much. I
Sure.
still had these things on my legs that like kept them from swelling, or these compression things, right? And the shackle, which I was still trying to understand. I'm like, I can't sit up and walk. Why am I shackled to a
Shackled.
bed? I can't even sit up. I can't even like move my body sideways. Like, I'm not running anywhere.
the why is for humiliation. It has nothing to do with security.
Yeah, no, there's no, and so there were times at which I had to ask for help to get my son back but I would just hold on to it till the nurse came in and asked them, for help or to feed. I did not sleep those entire 3 days. I just
Sure.
didn't want to miss a minute. And so I just spent as much quality time just holding him and looking at him. And then like the third day, my mom was able to come the last day.
Did you get extra time because it was a C-section? If you had a
there was one extra day, only because of, like I told you, that excursion in the operating room where I lost a lot of blood because of what my body was doing while I'm cut open. So where I needed to stay an extra day before I was like, okay to go back. So I did get 3 full days instead of like the 2 given a regular delivery. And so my mom was able to come that day, which also, having those 3 days, and because I went on, I believe it was a Friday or Saturday, it's like, okay, now we have one day where our court is open. So like my mom can get the custody and everything that she needs while I'm still in the hospital.
Yeah.
So that worked out. And so then it was like the time to go back, and you're very much made to just hand your child over to strangers I handed him over to the nurses, and the COs just push you out.
And so you knew at that point that, it was going to be some time before you saw your child again. And so that you're going in the same sort of transport van back to the facility.
Yeah.
Without the
Okay.
baby. And you've had the baby with you for 9 months, and now you don't.
Yeah.
And you must have felt that separation.
Yeah, I mean, my arms felt like 1,000,000 pounds, like once he was out of them. Like it was just like the emptiness was like that weight was insurmountable. I don't know.
Thank you so much for sharing so people can understand the humanity that is erased, ignored behind the walls. And I know that, this is a difficult process, and we're so thankful for you sharing this with us. You talked a little bit about this internal decision making and how you had started that journey before you were incarcerated. After the birth of your son, you are really thinking about this more. And I think what I heard you say was this was a journey that you embarked upon with decisions that you made, because a lot of people say, things like, well, that's what that person needed was prison. So can you sort of address that line of thinking?
Yeah, and 100%, because prisons are not a place of healing. They are only a place that exasperates the trauma and the pain and the barriers to someone ever successfully leading a life at which they would like to live and that is beneficial to society, to a family, to a child. So 100%, a prison is not a place at which someone is not a place where someone learns to thrive. I would say that what was needed for me was like the space to one, like, feel like it was okay at which to sit and take time for myself. And the system chose a prison facility, but that's something that can be provided to someone in any sort of form at which they're not feeling the pressures of survival at the time. So what a prison provides is meals, a bed, and a roof with all the dehumanization and strip of identity that comes with it, and all the collateral consequences at the end. I mean, it's not the place, but what was sort of always a little bit of a barrier was like the external forces of needing to pay bills and needing to like just survive. And so you never I never fully allowed myself the space at which to just sit with myself and not feel like I needed to do more. And that's also, like I said, the double-edged sword of growing up feeling like I need to be so much more. So I always felt guilty if I sat and did anything for myself or with myself. And so having a space at which like anyone can recover and sit and take the time without feeling and that's because all of that was just erased from like being possible for me. But no, the conditions of confinement and of a prison facility, I know for myself, hindered many things. It clearly still has a lot of impact on the pain that I carry day to day. And
that's
so
wait, I want to stay there for a second. I mean, so the one thing that's really important that you just said is that that the punishment inflicted by the state is not just the time that they say it is. You're never going to get back that time that you lost with your son.
Right.
You have this, and I'm sure there's some sort of PTSD, certain interactions with different when you encounter different situations out in the world, plus all the other collateral consequences. But it's really important for everybody to understand that the punishment, when you say don't do the crime if you can't do the time is a lot more than the time that people think it is. And that's what you're starting to get at.
Yeah. I mean, 100%, it has had a permanent effect on the bond that's developed between a mother and child in those very critical first years, where that's where the baby learns who to trust, their connection, right? And there's very much, you see that with that natural sort of that natural connection between my mom and my son. And that's, and we're in a very good place now, but his grandma is, everything to him. And so this is those developmental years you can't change that. That creates the building blocks of somebody's life. And so that's just, and sort of that connection that I also wasn't able to develop. I have a amazing mom who would come up twice a week and bring him to see him. And I am very lucky to have had that and create those times. The shirts that he would come up when he was a baby and throw up on during feed. I mean, I would sleep with those shirts for weeks, and to be able to smell him, have him. And then the shirts that I would wear, I would, send to the visiting room. My mom was able to take them home, and she'd have them in the crib with him, those sort of things to try and build, maintain. And I had a supportive mom in trying to do that, but it's very much changed. Yeah, the punishment is on sort of how the forever relationship between me and my son.
And so, Brittany, I know that, we talked about the spark that was created. You did a lot of internal work. And so what was the time that you ended up spending? And then I know that you have done a lot of really amazing work. So I really would like to make sure, because, of limited time, that we talk about that. So let's sort of talk about how much time did you spend, and then move on to sort of what happens next.
Right. I did. I found out that the time that I had to do one of my burglary charges, due to the amount of money, is considered a violent charge. Thus, I had to do 85% of my time, not 50. So although there was no physical violence, there was no interaction among people, it was a charge that I had to do 85% of my time for, which also became a shock to me during my incarceration, something I wasn't aware of until I was incarcerated, and somebody with the same charge notified me, and then confirmation from the administrative department. So that added a whole nother year and a half onto the time that I was expecting to do. So I ended up doing 3.5 years. But I had to do the remainder of my time in a halfway house. So the only way for me to, because the way that the system is set up, my halfway house date was before my parole date. And so my only chance was to go to a halfway house. My parole date was way too close to my end of sentence that the only way for me to get out sooner was to go to a halfway house. I went to a halfway house and had to finish, like I said, because of just how close my parole date was to my end of sentence, I just had to finish the remainder of my time in the halfway house, which was a little over a year. In that time, I worked multiple jobs. I had done higher education in prison. And so I had also made connections for years, writing correspondence letters to universities and departments of areas at which I found interesting. To me, it's human rights. So got connected to UConn prior to my release for a couple of years at the Human Rights Institute. And then so once I got into the halfway house, I connected with those people at which I was only doing written correspondence. And they helped me formulate my application to UConn when I got home and I was in the halfway house. So that following semester, I started attending UConn. I completed my bachelor's. I was working several jobs, just doing anything to make money and save money while I was in the halfway house, so serving tables, and I was a personal trainer at a gym, and I had found my way back into exercise and at the gym while incarcerated to try to, like, to write that elegantly on my resume to get a personal training job when I got home. But I worked in a gym for a couple of years.
Right.
For the state of Connecticut. And so nonetheless, worked a couple of those jobs, like staining log cabins, doing really anything, just working as many hours as I could, saving as much money as I could. So then I came home. It took a lot to get an apartment. I had to sit there and get letters of recommendations, explain myself again, right? I mean, I've already had to do this in court, but now for everything I have to do in life, I have to explain and recount why I am qualified or why I am worthy of any of the things I'm asking for, why I'm worth, even my waitressing job, why I shouldn't be judged for being an addict in the past. Like, how can they trust me now? How you're not going to steal from all these things that I have to every single time. Getting into college, I mean, I have to check the box and say, yeah, I'm this, but like, this is who I am. And I just sit there and relive my story again for all these strangers. And so, when is it enough? Like, when have you told your story enough where, like, you don't have to do it anymore? It's not a thing when you're formerly incarcerated, no matter what. Like, you always have to justify your worthiness of anything, of opportunity, of credibility, right? So it took a lot, but I got a studio apartment. I mean, I had a year and a half of denials, right? As planning in a halfway house, because that happens. I mean, it's impossible to get an apartment with a criminal conviction. And so nonetheless, I find one. The idea was to just really be as close to my mom as possible. So I was like a 7-minute drive from them, because my mom had been, doing some, she had to get to work every morning. So like she was doing a lot of things to just like manage my son. So now I was able to go over in the morning at 5:30. She could go to work instead of her dropping her off with my sisters. Like the village was raising my son. So now I was close enough to be able to do these things and be there. And so he would wake up and I'd, be at my mom's house. So I was slowly just like inserting myself into his daily life, bringing him to school, these sort of things that I thought would be difficult for my mom to allow trust for, but she very much just saw who I was in my actions. I know my mom's not in the world, right? Is they very much don't, words are sort of taken with a grain of salt. So it's all through action that I needed to just prove who I was. And so within that time of pursuing education, I got accepted into Yale Law School's Access to Law program. And that's the first time, and this was through a professor from one of my higher education and prison courses had reached out and said, hey, why don't you apply for this? And I was not expecting to get in. I got interviewed and I got in, and like the whole like year and a half, I'm like, you guys are aware that I have like I don't even know how many felons. I think there's like 7. I don't know what actually I got charged with. I know right now in producing like my pardon application and getting my rap sheet, I'm like, okay, as part of the plea deal, like, okay, this didn't go. Like, I had no idea what actually happened in court, as I told you. And so nonetheless, I get like, you're aware, like, they're like, no, like, you can do it. You can go to law school. And I'm like, okay, like, if these people believe like in me, like, I'm gonna do it. If doors like I just keep working hard and I keep leaning into education and I keep finding like these, you know, these couple people that believe in me. I'm going to lean on it and I'm going to do my best. And I'm going to, you know, really show up for myself and prove to myself like these are things, and then prove to the world that people with criminal convictions are not their past, they're not their worst mistake, and that anybody could change, just given like an open door, just give someone an opportunity, right? And so that's you know, ultimately went through that process with the Access to Law Fellowship, got into UConn Law. I started my master's in the process, so I'm finishing my master's in public policy and going into my second year of law school at UConn Law. And then through the process, I've, you know, continued my professional experience right now managing Connecticut's Juvenile Justice Policy and Oversight Committee at the state legislature, the assistant director of the National Prison Debate League, a visiting fellow at Yale Law School in the Shell Center for International Human Rights. And
I can't keep up. I mean,
I'm like,
listen,
my mind is like, wow, I can't
Yeah.
keep up either.
Here's what
And-
we'll do. You give us all these things later and we'll put it in the show
Yeah.
notes.
Yeah.
You like the whole resume for the, like,
yeah.
this is Brittany's, this who's who of everything she's done. Yeah.
So, Brittany, I know you've done some
Ah.
things at the legislature in terms of public testimony, things like that.
Right.
Was that something that like you knew how to do, or how did you get into that?
No, so that was not something I knew how to do. You know, being ultimately like stripped of all sort of like fundamental rights while you're incarcerated. I wasn't attuned to how to promote them or uphold them for myself. So upon my release, and you know, given my personal journey that I've told you, it was very much a passion of mine to ensure that like the system changes in which like humanity is upheld, human rights are preserved, and no woman who's incarcerated, who's pregnant, goes through what I've gone through. And so I tell my story in a way that like I don't want this to ever happen to somebody else.
Sure.
And so given the opportunity with the ACLU of Connecticut and the tools of the Connecticut Justice Alliance, an introduction to public policy and laws, and seeing like the conversations that are being had that are so sort of misguided by opinion and like lack of fact or personal testimony. You're like, wait, this is like, we need to like ground this in something real. And so that's where I very much find my draw to connection of personal experience, but also the data and research that supports all the policies at which we talk about.
Right.
None of these are just like opinions that say like these sort of things don't happen. I mean, all of which the policies in which reform is pushed and addressed is because they lie in like international fundamental human rights, or like the data shows that like our system sucks and it's failing everyone. Right? Like when you spend 60 billion like in the United States a year on a system with like an 80% failure rate, like if this was
There's something wrong.
If this was any other industry, like you'd be pulling the plug. So like we need to sort of ground it and like, no, acknowledge that like this is wrong and there are better ways and we have other models. And that's sort of the work I do with the International Justice Exchange and my most recent ventures to Norway and Germany, looking at their system. We have models. It's just we're so grounded in like the need to maintain what's always been, and that's a system that was, you know, sort of that's grounded in and fundamentally driven by the criminalization of race, the criminalization of poverty, the sort of the classism, the racism that plagues the system, right? Which allows us to cast off certain people, and
we've been doing it for
we've
been doing it for so long. We've been doing it for so long that it's that in so many decades now, that it's hard for people to even envision, like you're saying, another system, because it's, the first go-to is maximum punishment,
Right.
and this if one person does one thing, then the response is we have to equal it out by causing them harm, right? We have to punish. And that's just
Well, and we're not even looking for equaling anything. We're looking for complete decimation. Like the proportionality
that's
of
true.
the responses is astounding, particularly as compared to like other responses that are possible. And Brittany, I'm glad that you mentioned your exploration of like other ways and other systems, because I was really inspired when I saw the Connecticut Public documentary of the recent trip to Norway and enjoyed your participation in that. So we'll definitely throw that in the show notes. Could you just briefly talk really quickly about what that trip was about?
Yeah, so about 2 years ago now, I like lose track of time because but so it's about 2 years now. I was on a panel with the Institute of Municipal and Regional Policy regarding, some data and policies on youth car theft. And so from that connection, I was introduced to the executive director, Andrew Clark, who just met with me. Their institute is also out of Yukon, and so we were talking about, we shared, he was aware of my lived experience through other work that I had done, but also I was trying to talk about like my academic aspirations, right? Because it's really to get to a point in which, you know, I can also I also have like the academic credentials to like be taken seriously and heard, that like it's not just lived experience, but like I can ground myself in a way at which, the those in positions of power would take seriously.
Sure.
And so I was reading a white paper that they had produced back in 2021 it was a white paper on international human rights and the crossroads that Connecticut was at, because given the pandemic, we had reached a turning point in which our system was, we had a lower prison population. And so it was like, okay, we can tell that like through COVID, we changed policies, we let people out, and we're still okay. Like, so we can continue this downward trend. Here's like where international human rights comes to play. Like, we're at this crossroads. How do we sustain this trajectory of lowering the prison rates? And so I said, my interest is in the intersection of human rights and the criminal legal system and economics, oddly enough, if you can understand that. But not, I sort of, he was like, yeah, like let's do something with this. And I was like, okay, I'm just gonna start reaching out to people. And so I started exploring international models. I started reaching out to people from Norway and the Norwegian correctional system to inquire. We made some connections with people in Norway, the international director of the Norwegian Correctional Service. We like explored these conversations, held webinars, and then were able to take a delegation from Connecticut over to Norway to visit the Norwegian prisons, different parts of their system, etc., and sort of get that visceral experience and be able to take sort of have these conversations with incarcerated people in Norway, because it's one thing to read a paper that maybe a publication or the correctional department is putting out about their agency, but like it's really important to have the conversations with people who are incarcerated, no matter, like in the United States and in Norway and in Germany, right? To be able to say, like, what is your experience? Like, is it what we're reading? I don't want to sit there and promote a system at which like is saying that it's the best, but the people are really oppressed, right? That's not what I want to be doing. And so we were able to go there and just, there was no sort of barrier to like who we could talk to, anybody passing down the hall, like we could sit and have a conversation with. And so there was, that was great to sort of be able to have that open access to their facilities. And then we went to just recently, as a continuation of this, our most recent trip in June was to Germany, a new delegation. So this was with the chief state's attorney, the chief public defender, executive director of the judicial branch, to go over and see their probation services, their prison system as well. This was all about like sentencing. So a lot of members of Connecticut Sentencing Commission went over to Germany.
Nice.
And so we learned about their bail system, right? There's a lot of other pieces outside of conditions of confinement that lead to the high rates of imprisonment here in the United States and Connecticut. And that goes into sentencing, that goes into our pretrial bail system, all that stuff that compounds. And
Yeah.
so yeah, that's the work. We're in the process, myself and the University of Network of Human Rights, the Institute of Municipal and Regional Policy, of updating that white paper with some lay of the land now here in Connecticut. And then, still if we don't take action now, like we see like the upward trend again. So
Right.
Amber, Brittany knows way too much. We could probably keep going. And I'm looking at the time, and I know that we did have some time constraints today. So can you ask your final question?
Sure. So Brittany, I know that, your journey has been long and winding, and I know that even myself, even though I've never been incarcerated, I'm, affected by the system through a family member. I found myself like in the story. If you could give one piece of advice to someone who is experiencing something that connects with your journey, what would you tell them as words of encouragement?
I would say to take themselves seriously and allow themselves a chance. I would also encourage that although there may be compounded guilt and shame for things that someone has been doing in their life for a while that they're not proud of, there's always a chance to turn it around. And there's always a chance to make those things right, whether it's directly or indirectly to others, and make an impact. I think that's something that I very much am driven by, is that if I was able to do this and where I once saw myself to where I am today, I know that anyone can do it. And so I would urge anyone to not cast themselves off, and to take themselves seriously enough to give themselves a chance to sit and say, I am worth it and I can do it. And yeah, it may suck, and yeah, it's going to be hard, and yeah, I can't even see how I'm going to do it or what it's going to lead to, but I just need to try and take that first step, and then take the next step, and the pieces will fall in line, and just trust the process, but to not give up in the process of doing that.
Brittany, thank you so much for being with us today. We've covered a lot, and we're so thankful for you taking the time. Jason, did you have any last thoughts?
I'll just say that, Brittany, hearing we gave a lot of time at the beginning of this discussion to the early trauma in your life and the things that you went through. And then, of course, the whole experience of giving birth and separation from your child. We didn't give nearly enough time to all the wonderful things that you've done after and what you're doing now. It's incredible. Your journey's incredible. You're still young. You've got a whole life ahead of you with wonderful things. I hope that you and your family and everybody just continues on this positive journey from here on out. So thank you so much for being here, for being so open with us. And I know it's going to touch many, many people when they listen to what you have to say today. So thank you.
No, thank you all. What you're doing is extremely important, in that we're able to open the doors back up and say, no, there are human beings inside of there. Like, maybe if you would take the time to look past what a headline says, or what the media says, or what a prosecutor said, or like what's just put on a piece of paper on like running a background check. you would see the human being and you would see the potential, and then maybe you could empathize and give opportunity too. And these podcasts and these sort of things are the way in which we need to do that and give voice and face and in space to demonstrating that they're all are human beings and worthy of, a second chance.
Absolutely. Sure. Thank you, Brittany. Until next time, Amber.
We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Amplified Voices, a podcast lifting the experiences of people and families impacted by the criminal legal system. For more information, episodes, and podcast notes, visit amplifiedvoices.show.